papers now, and then the papers will be presented in the order in your program. Please hold all applause until all 3 papers are done, and then I'll offer a short comment in the papers, and we'll have time for questions. So our first paper today is Native American Contributions to the American Revolution, which will be given by Ben Curcia. Ben is a history major at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, who will be graduating next month. And I also would like to point out that Ben has one of the highest GPAs of all of our graduating seniors. Our second paper today is Wigs, Gender, and Politics in the Revolutionary Era, which will be given by Jennifer Quinn. And Jennifer is a history major at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, which will be graduating next year. And then our final paper is Before the White House, New York City's Capital Legacy, which will be given by Thomas Balsarski. And he is an associate professor at Eastern Connecticut State University, and his first book, Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King, was published in 2019. And that.
So, before I start, I'd just like to thank Abigail Chandler and Neha overall for giving me this opportunity to present my paper. So today we are going to be talking about the American Revolution, but I'm going to tell you a very different story about the Revolution from the ones we usually tell. First, I will focus on the southern theater of the war, and second, I will be focusing on Native American tribes in that region, particularly the Choctaw and Chickasaw. Not only were the Choctaw and Chickasaw substantial forces that both sides had to consider when fighting in the Revolution, but they were allies the British felt could trust to win battles for them with minimal aid. Overall, Southern natives were a considerable power within the context of the Revolution, who looked to not simply pick a side and hope to win, but focus on their own interests through a solid mix of warfare and diplomacy. War in the South did not begin until around 1778, and that was when the British focused much of its war efforts in North America. Many of the early conflicts in the Southern theater by the British occurred in Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina. Early victories by the British in Savannah and Charlestown made it appear like the colonists would lose as the Southern Revolution efforts seemed to be collapsing. However, with decisive counter-victories, like the Battle of Kings Mountain, where the British tried to finish off the colonial stand in South Carolina, the British realized that trying to win back the colonies was not worth the trouble. Although Britain did put up somewhat of a fight, they could not place all their attention on the southern theater of the war. Britain's substantial reliance on loyalist efforts in the South meant that there were unrealistic expectations placed on loyalist Native American groups. Many British outposts were laid upon native land in areas like Pensacola and Mobile, because it made conspiring and trading with the native settlements much easier. Britain felt its other colonial possessions that were under threat by European powers like the French and Spanish were more vital than their North American possessions. So this is just a kind of an overview of what that territory would look like in 1779. One prominent figure relating to British and Southern Native relations was John Stuart, who was head of the Indian Department. Stuart, who began his position during the 7 Years' War to keep natives steadfastly loyal or so divided they would not be able to aid the French in the Revolution, Stuart was essentially a diplomat between the British and natives of the southern territories. In a letter to the Crown in 1765, Stuart stated, "The Choctaws are generally well inclined and reconciled to our interests, although the French inhabitants of New Orleans continue their intrigues and endeavors to keep up a party among them. The nation of Chickasaws, notwithstanding which they in general continue faithful and constant in their attachment to us, and may be depended upon should their assistance at any time be wanted." One can gather from this letter that there was clearly a relationship established amongst the British and the native tribes, for Stuart speaks about trade with them and how they were very reliable in the event of an emergency. This letter also shows how reliant natives have become on trade from European traders. And the British were often the most dependable and available trade partners due to John Stuart and the Southern Indian Department spending a surplus of money on maintaining relations with the natives. The department began in 1763 as a treaty was developed that stated the British promised protection and supplies and protection of the right of Indian hunting grounds, and the natives promised safety to British traders and loyalty to the British government. The creation of the Proclamation Line of 1763, which clearly demarcated lands for Native Americans and for white colonists, meant that many natives felt like the British respected native sovereignty more compared to other groups, like the Americans or the French. Simultaneously, natives were often at odds with colonists due to the continued encroachment of the Virginians, as the Southern Indians called all land hungry frontiersmen. This would convince the natives the best defense of their interests lies with the British. However, this idea of the British having positive interactions with natives comes to light even before 1763. During the French and Indian War, when the Chickasaw decided to side with the British due to solidify trade relations from the past, natives apparently being loyal to the British and simply stating one's loyalty to a power and actually acting on that statement are two very different details. As one will see when analyzing this region's tribes, native tribes ultimately made decisions to benefit themselves over any native powers, as they were simply fighting to survive and remain as intact as possible while maintaining trade relations. And this is just, this red line references where the Proclamation Line would be during 1763. Being based in Mississippi and Alabama meant that one faction, the Western Choctaw, did not face as much outside influence other than the British. Where the Choctaw differ from a tribe like the Chickasaw is the Eastern faction was closer to other powers like the French. Unlike the Chickasaw, who were clear British allies throughout the French and Indian War and did not really mix with other powers previously, the Choctaw were much more split on how to act. For example, when the French and Indian War began, it was true that the Choctaws were embroiled in civil war, caused in part by arguments over whether to fight against or ally with the French, as one side was funded by the British and the other funded by the French. Typically, it was the Eastern Choctaw that actively fought alongside the French and eventually the Spanish, and shared much closer trading relationships with these other powers compared to the British. During the 7 Years' War, the Chickasaw found themselves against the Choctaw, due in part to the Choctaws' decision to fight with French in some capacity, with long-standing territorial struggles between the tribes. However, the Chickasaw and Choctaw did eventually make peace, as the French were purged from North America. This did not stop some factions of the Choctaw from still convening with the Spanish, as many British officials, such as Alexander Cameron, faced pressing problems with the continuation of Spanish efforts among the Choctaw. Choctaw simply wanted to create as many trading relationships as they could, and did not want to claim a strict alliance with the British as the Chickasaw did. However, this does not mean that there were not times that the Choctaw, such as the northern faction, did come to the defense of the English when motivated by promises of goods. Primarily located in Mississippi and Alabama, the Chickasaw were a tribe that had always had solid relations with the British and appeared the most loyal out of any of the southern tribes. From past major conflicts between opposing powers in North America, such as the French and Indian War, the Chickasaw have always felt more connected and even fought alongside the British, largely due to their jovial trade relationships. The Chickasaw were also often at odds against tribes who at times sided with the French, such as the Choctaw, further motivating their position taken during the French and Indian War. Paimataha was the main diplomat for the Chickasaw and the man responsible for maintaining such a close relationship with the British. In one instance, he responded to the Creek tribes' claim of British American colonists encroaching on their land being the greater of the two evils between the French and the British. Paimataha stated, "Had it not been for English help, the artful and covetous French, by the weight of a presence and skill of their forked tongue would before now have set you against each other in the very same manner they did the Choctaw. It was evident that Paimataha had an opinionated view on how to approach the Revolutionary War. However, their response to the actual event may appear differently than what their words say. As the times of revolution approached, the Choctaw were still mostly British allies in the Revolutionary War, despite continuing to communicate with other foreign powers. Choctaws were looked at by the British as defenders of territories along the Mississippi River and as antagonists in places like Mobile after it was overtaken by the Spanish. As specified by O'Donnell, late in 1780 they were doing just that. Driven by their need for supplies, a number of Choctaw warriors eventually began voluntary harassment of the Spanish garrison at Mobile. The Choctaw knew the British were widely available trade partners, and they could attain supplies and better their position by showing loyalty. This concept can once again be seen in 1781 as the Spanish fleet appeared to be threatening Pensacola. When the Spanish fleet appeared off Pensacola in early March of 1781, Galvez's army of 4,000 men would be met by only 1,500 British soldiers and some 400 Choctaw, plus about 100 Creeks who straggled in after the siege was underway. With a series of raids against the Spanish at Mobile and a staunch defense of the British Pensacola against the Spanish, despite communicating with the Spanish about trade in the past, the Choctaw seemed to be ultimately British allies and cared mostly about their ability to trade to benefit their own interests. However, Choctaws began getting angry at the British for not keeping their word and seemingly taking advantage of them during both the raids of Mobile and the defense of Pensacola. In the raids of Mobile, the Choctaw felt they could not move or act on their own unless commanded so by the British to do so. Some Choctaws, as the factions were still split at this time, even supported the Spanish. In one example, British commander John Campbell told the Choctaw to retreat and then wait to assemble for the next war. In response, the Choctaw would respond not so readily the next time they were called upon, as stated by O'Donnell. Why would the Choctaw want their fate to be left in the hands of the British and only be called when the situation was the most dire? A similar realization occurred at the defense of Pensacola in 1781 when the Choctaw went into battle without the British putting in any effort to back the native band. A Choctaw chief was deeply angered by the idea that they were forced to fight alone against the concentrated Spanish force. Pensacola, like Mobile, was also lost in 1781. After the British lost many of its North American holdings, the Empire only held part of Florida. As British power waned in North America, the Choctaw wavered, looking for a favorable sign. Support for the British by the Choctaw began to fade as the tribe felt their efforts were not being matched by the British Army, and they wanted to protect the tribe's well-being by staying out of future warfare. Described in the Encyclopedia of Alabama as Britain's staunchest southeastern allies throughout the 18th century, many people analyzing the Revolution may think that the Chickasaw response would be an obvious choice, fight along the British. Despite often being described in a manner that associates the Chickasaw with violence, Paimataha transformed the Chickasaw from the most military people of any about the Great River to now being known as peacemakers. Peace efforts by the Chickasaw began by establishing peace with their infamous enemy, the Choctaw, who they historically fought over land with until around 1760. These peace efforts would continue into the 1770s as the Revolution started. Instead of jumping to Britain's defense, the Chickasaw, led by Paimataha, decided to play the role of diplomacy and peacemaking. Realizing they could not do without white people, but also following nativist beliefs in not fighting other Indians, Paimataha was left with the choice of trade and diplomacy after facing major losses during the French and Indian War. It was clear that the Chickasaw relied on European trade to stay afloat, as most native tribes relied on the trade and gifts given by the British during the times of the Revolution. Even though the Chickasaw faced another potentially hostile power in Spain when the Spanish had possession of East Florida, Paimataha even tried to realize new peaceful relations with the Cowpaws to create a connection to the French, showing their desire for trade overshadowed loyalty to the British. Despite constantly reassuring loyalties and promising military reinforcements to British officials that dealt with natives like Alexander Cameron, when James Willing attempted a raid along the Mississippi River in the name of the U.S., the Chickasaw allowed them to have access to the territories in order to stay neutral to war efforts. The Chickasaw, towards the ends of the war, realized that they truly owed the British nothing. As the war trapped in 1782, Chickasaw began asking Americans for parlays, where they also stated the English put the bloody tomahawk into our hands, telling us that we should have no goods if we do not exert ourselves to the greatest point of resentment against you. By now we find our mistake and distresses. In order to best protect their own interests, as the end of the war neared, the Chickasaw began to attempt pacifist missions to reconcile with the Americans after being loyal to the British for so long. It was clear that the Chickasaw were a group that were not going to act violently on behalf of the British. Despite being their allies, in their perspective, simply acting as a neutral power and not getting involved on the side of the U.S. was being loyal to the British in itself. Led by Paimataha, the Chickasaw wished to maintain trade relations in peace with the British, but they did not want to fight in order to protect the British Empire. After the British lost the war, the Chickasaw continued their peaceful diplomacy, even though they believed in the idea of alliances, when a pan-Indian Southern Confederacy was being suggested to the Chickasaw by the Creek. They did not want to surrender independent Chickasaw foreign policy making to McGillivray and the Creeks. Chickasaw continued their attempts with their commercial endeavors by facilitating good relations with the Spanish, which they had already established after the British were expunged, and even began relations with the French in Illinois, who they no longer perceived as a threat. The most notable act of diplomacy that the Chickasaw had was they had began peace talks and treaty negotiations with the U.S. as of 1786. Southeastern Native Americans were put in a very difficult position during this war. Many tribes were long-term trading partners who even fought with the British in the past, so the idea of the British and Southeastern natives fighting together is not far-fetched. Due to geographic location, Chickasaw and Choctaw could act more diplomatically and passively, as their land was harder to reach than many other tribes. These factors add to why each tribe acted in the way they did, along with previous historical context. British expectations for their native allies were too ambitious, and the southern tribes quickly realized this. Although trade did incentivize natives at times, and many relied on goods given by the British, past tragedies like during the 7 Years' War made them not want to fully commit to war for the British. Between encroaching colonists and the unreliable British, natives had no choice but to make decisions based on their own needs. Both European powers, like the British and its officials, and even Spain, used trade to try and trick the natives into doing their bidding, but the natives had enough sway to make decisions based on their own beliefs. In this last figure, as you can see, the Choctaws and the Chickasaws in the far left are clearly much further away from the colonial territory, which is more like on the coast. So that's why you have more passive diplomatic missions because of their geographic location.
Our next speaker today will be Jennifer Quinn.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the organizers of this event. So, popular notions of 18th century wigs are the all-planku styles like these. The hairstyles that this print satirizes, though, were a small blip in the world of 1700s hair. Images like these also give the impression that women wore a majority of the tonsorial cleavage, which for the majority of the 18th century was not true. Men wore wigs for decades longer than women did. A traditional narrative of wigs in 18th century America is that they were cast off as symbols of European aristocracy and replaced by the egalitarian hair of the everyman. This story, though, lacks depth, noticeably only aligning with the trajectory of men's hairstyles. Wigs grew rapidly in popularity for men throughout the 17th and 18th centuries until they began to disappear in the 1770s. Women, though, only began wearing elaborate coiffures in the late 1760s. Although lavish hairstyles were criticized for their luxury during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and then later during the Revolutionary era, when both men's and women's fashions are considered, it becomes apparent that the rejection of this luxury was inherently gendered. The end of the wildly popular male wig came not as a reaction to criticisms of luxury, as these have been entertained intermittently for decades, but rather as increasing numbers of women sported elaborate hairstyles in the decades surrounding the Revolutionary War, revealing that criticisms of luxury were a pretext for criticisms of femininity. For most of the 18th century, women wore their hair in a simple style, preferring to incorporate natural hair rather than wearing a wig. This is not to say that women were alien to false hair pieces, though. False hair and hair pieces enjoyed great diversity of usages and styles throughout the 18th century for men and women. Barbers, wig makers, and merchants offered a range of items for sale, from the large periwigs, you can see on the top left there, to which were popular in the earlier part of the century, to individual curls called buckles, which you could pin into your own hair at your will. While not exclusively the case, for most of the century, men wore full wigs while women used individual smaller hair pieces to supplement their own natural hair. As hair pieces were worn by both genders, but to different effects, the distinction between men's and women's styles does not appear to have been whether or not one wore false hair, either in wigs or in individual pieces, but rather the size of the final hairstyle. Therefore, I will generally not distinguish between the two, either wig or smaller hairpiece, but instead focus on the size and style of the hair's appearance, with the understanding that almost all elaborate styles contain some element of false hair. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, wigs and male hairstyles were turbulent topics for Puritans in colonial America. Richard Godbeer analyzed these concerns in his paper Perversions of Anatomy, Anatomies of Perversion, in which he focused especially on the diary of Samuel Sewall. Godbeer found that worries over luxurious hairstyles for men often centered around how fashion has the potential to disrupt social hierarchies. Fashion is unique and has the ability not only to reinforce but violate social boundaries. How one is perceived depends both on the intent of the individual and where they are located in the social landscape. Fashion was different than the items one might use to display their class or taste inside their own home, such as fine china or expensive furniture. Whereas home goods communicated privately to close friends or relations, one's appearance communicated more broadly, assuming a public identity. Clothes, including accessories such as wigs, function as a nonverbal language, a code through which people communicated their social identity to others, shaping the ways in which they were perceived and treated. Godbeer observed how this perturbed the hierarchy during the Puritans. Their special concern was how men's hairstyles could muddy the boundaries between men and women. Even long natural hair on men was cause for alarm, as they believed that men were meant to cut their hair short while women kept theirs long. Wearing fake hair was deceptive. This was made all the more troubling when considering what wigs were made of, generally women's hair. In this understanding, men were literally putting on long women's hair, while women were cutting their hair short like men to be sold into wigs. Apart even from social concerns about appearance, wigs could be seen as literally transformative of one's gender, transferring the defining characteristics of one sex onto the other. It was not just the individual wearer of the wig who was affected by this, the Puritans believed. Convinced that sin and chaos went hand in hand, they argued that even seemingly trivial lapses into immoral behavior had profound consequences for social stability. It was this interplay of moral and social concerns that motivated critics of the periwig. The actions and sins of individual people had a moral effect on the larger societal body. This framework laid the ground for fashion to be criticized on a larger socio-political level. Fashion, then, was never just an individual choice. Despite this societal grumbling, wigs and extravagant hairstyles for men did grow in popularity throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Even Puritan men began wearing wigs. Cotton Mather wore one in his 1728 portrait. in which he calls himself Cotinus Malleus. Archaeologist Laura Galkey described the heyday of wig usage in colonial America in her paper Trust for Success, Male Hair Care and Wig Hair Colors at George Washington's Childhood Home, in which she detailed an excavation of implements used in wig care and barbering. Called Home House by the family, this Virginian plantation was occupied by the Washingtons from 1738 to 1772. Galkey's paper delved into the attitudes and habits of elite families like the Washingtons toward wigs in the mid-18th century, approximately the years during which the Washingtons owned the property. For the first half of the century, wigs were predominantly worn by men, with women wearing their natural hair. Wigs were also quite costly, making up the single most expensive article of a gentleman's costume. Galkey noted that they were a necessary expense, though, as they solidified the wearer as a member of the upper echelon. The wigs symbolized refinement, sophistication, and class, the type of person unsullied by the potentially degrading nature of life on the edges of British society. In contrast with earlier Puritan hesitancy towards the adoption of wigs, by the 1740s, wigs were widely worn by men in Britain and its colonies. The elaborate, fluffy styles of wigs were almost universally coveted, and at the height of wig fashion in the mid-century, a gentleman not wearing a wig would have his hair curled, pomaded, and powdered to resemble one. This popularity of men's hairstyles began to fade soon after this peak, as Galkey described. This trend towards less extravagant hairstyles was part of a larger Republican political movement associated with flamboyant fashion obsessed at the expense of their subjects. The move to simple styles in attire as well as hairstyles was in part a reaction to women wearing wigs beginning in the mid-1760s. These two concerns, of politically relevant luxury and of gender anxiety, were intertwined with hairstyles and with each other, and not for the first time. Historian Kay Coleman detailed part of their downfall during the decades following their peak in her paper Fashion and the Cultural Wars of Revolutionary Philadelphia. As with both Galkey and Gauthier, Coleman wrote of fashion as a way to project one's identity within a social landscape, with the potential to both affirm and undermine hierarchies. This influence on identity and hierarchy was profound in Philadelphia during the 1760s and 1770s, as it underwent significant political turmoil. It was a city of mixed identities and loyalties, serving as both home to many wealthy loyalists, as well as the seat of colonial government and patriotic resistance. Here, Hallman found that hairstyles especially became interwoven with discourse over politics, identity, gender, and virtue. Leading up to and during the American Revolution was a rhetorical movement encouraging abstinence from luxury and imported goods in pursuit of patriotic, self-sufficient virtue and to punish British economic tyranny, including wig non-consumption campaigns in the 1760s and the homespun movement. The degree to which these efforts were authentic as opposed to being largely performative has been debated. Either way, wigs and popular high-roll styles fell on the wrong side of this controversy, coming to symbolize anti-Republican indulgence and dubious national loyalty. Similar to the questionable authenticity of patriot participation in non-consumption crusades, Hallman emphasized the association of elaborate grand hair with potentially treasonous luxury did not mean that all luxury accessories and fashions have the same reputation. Inherently male luxury items could instead serve to bolster one's reputation, as a show of proud, bold display was useful to intimidate foreign enemies. With the outbreak of armed conflict, men could adopt in military mode those at once masculine, legitimately patriotic, and outwardly impressive, negotiating the twin requirements of Republican virtue and formidable display by using a soldier's dress to forestall charges of foppery. Yet women's expressions of femininity and material, visual, and social power through fashion were politically embarrassing and dangerous, according to Wig men, because they signified disloyalty to the American cause in the nation's capital. Military dress epitomized the equation of masculine luxury with virtue, republicanism, and patriotism. High hairstyles, whether on men or women, were categorized oppositely, showing effeminate excess rather than tasteful grooming. An analysis of 18th century American portraiture paints a specific timeline onto these changing attitudes toward ornamental hairstyles. While only a minute subset of the American people, portraiture gives insight into the same group of wealthy elites who would most likely have purchased and worn wigs and hairpieces, and who were most closely following fashion trends. After examining 472 portraits from 4 museums, I found noticeable patterns in hairstyles for both men and women. I specifically observed whether these styles were high or low, intimate or plain, and with or without the obvious presence of a wig. With the exception of only a handful, almost no man was depicted in only his natural hair prior to the 1770s. Large, bountiful wigs abounded in the portraits of men for the first two-thirds of the century. Up through the 1740s, especially common was the periwig, distinctive for its fluffy long hair with a harsh part down the middle. During the mid-century decades, various styles of tie wigs became popular. While perhaps more subdued than the voluminous periwigs, tie wigs was still certainly grand and certainly not cheap. Tie wigs are probably the most iconic male hairstyle of the era, with buckles on either side of the head and the long tied-back ponytail giving it its familiar shape. At the end of this era, peak of male wig usage, higher, more extravagant hairstyles for women began to appear. Until then, portraits showed women without exception wore their hair under a covering or in a half-up style with little volume on top. These represent a low style, to contrast the high roll styles which would become popular later, much to the exasperation of apparently virtuous patriots. The first evidence appearing in portraits of high roll is that of Elizabeth Green, Mrs. Ebenezer Storer, in 1767. She was wearing her natural hair, as evidenced by the lack of a harsh line on her forehead which would indicate a full wig, but almost certainly used false hair pieces to add to the volume and stability of the style. After Storer in 1767, portraits increasingly depicted women with higher, more extravagant hairstyles. A sketch John Singleton Copley did for his 1776 portrait of his family showed the graceful updo of his wife's hair in exquisite detail. As more women began exhibiting high-roll, extravagant styles and the portraiture examined, men started to wear simpler, more subdued styles. Although male wig wearers had not by any means disappeared in the 1770s and 1780s, they were more noticeably interspersed with increasingly numbers of men in only their natural hair. Copley's 1774 portrait of Adam Babcock, for example, showed him with his natural hair cut very short in the front and with gentle, unobtrusive curls around the side of the head. Using portraits to observe the rise and fall of lavish men's hairstyles, or the rise continuing to rise in the case of lavish women's hairstyles, aligns well with previous historiography on attitudes and anxieties surrounding hair and gender. Much scholarship, though, on hairpieces and wigs has focused on men, exploring male ownership of wigs and wigs as social signifiers of masculinity. Clearly, there is ample opportunity and evidence for research into the history of women's hair and the gendered nature of scholarship. Examining portraits is one such path, and it shows a definite leap in the rise of voluminous women's hairstyles in the late 1760s and early 1770s, both in size and popularity. Quickly following this transition is an appreciable decrease in the flamboyance of men's hairstyles. At the same time that large hairstyles were remaining for men, came the well-known critique of the macaroni. Satirical cartoons depicted the macaroni as a frivolous, laughable man, overdressed to absurd proportions. The most famous of these cartoons were drawn in London, depicting caricatures of society men, but they were printed and popular in America as well. The key identifying feature of these cartoons was the enormous wig that each of the macaronis wore. These styles of tall wigs did not appear in male portraiture, instead appearing to ape the tall hairstyles of women. The silly figure of the macaroni contrasted the serious, discerning demeanor of a real man, one who was not prone to indulgence or flights of fancy. Particularly famous macaroni cartoon, What Is This, My Son Tom, juxtaposed the outlandish macaroni with his humbly dressed father, someone viewers would have seen as too underdressed, alluding to the idea of a real man as someone in between, not overly styled, not a country bumpkin. Wigs in these satirical prints represented style over substance, a far cry from their refined gentility just a few decades earlier. Men were not the only ones lampooned for their extravagant hair. Indeed, many political cartoons depicting women at this time had their large hairstyles as a central point. A British mezzotint, A Society of Patriotic Ladies, depicted a group of women declaring their intent to boycott English tea in 1774. The scene around them was chaotic, with a baby spilling food on the floor and being licked by a urinating dog, suggesting these frivolous women should focus on more important things. Two more cartoons, done by London publishers famous for their macaroni prints,
depicted women with entire battle scenes from the Revolutionary War in their ludicrously oversized hairdos. These satires used large hairstyles on women to both trivialize the American independence movement and mock women's participation in fashion trends. Big hair in the 1770s became a symbol of illegitimate political expression and feminine indulgence. Only after women began wearing high hairstyles in the late 1760s and early 1770s did criticisms reminiscent of puritanical ones reemerge, always tinged with gendered disdain. The macaroni was not mocked because he participated in luxury. Military men wore luxurious and practical items as well. The macaroni was mocked because it was a fop. While men could pursue their taste for personal luxury in legitimate, masculine, and politically acceptable ways, whether through the military mode or gentility, feminine expressions of luxury were never legitimate. This scornful attitude is not limited to history, as evidenced by the current description from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts of the 1772 John Singleton Copley portrait of Dorothy Quincy. Dorothy Quincy's costume is both graceful and stylish. Her hair was probably combed over a roll to produce a fashionably high coiffure, atop which she wears a dress cap of lace, gauze, and ribbon, a frivolous and very feminine confection that serves no practical purpose, according to art historian Eileen Rivera. While indulgent femininity is cast as frivolous, indulgence of the masculine variety is rarely given the same treatment. If that indulgence lays too frilly, it is foppish, bad for being feminine. The 1770s were not the first time in the 18th century that wigs and other large hairstyles were criticized for being wasteful and indulgent. Puritan commentary had overtly gendered overtones, worrying that wigs might transform and feminize men. Yet the popularity of opulent hairstyles continued to grow despite these concerns. The difference, though, was that women were not wearing wigs or high-rolled hair in the early 18th century. Once women began adopting these styles, one's fanciful hair became definitely associated with feminine luxury rather than masculine luxury. Then attacks on large hairstyles began to accelerate in both amount and ferocity. These decades, the 1770s and 1780s, will be when men's hair finally began to eschew the wig for good. Wigs only really became wasteful decadence when correlated with women, implicating femininity as the real problem rather than luxury. Thank you very much.
Now Tom will be giving this paper, okay?
Let's see. Okay. No idea why I did that. So thank you all for coming, and who can identify the city on this map? And it's not Bolton, sorry. That's Washington, D.C. And so the paper today is Before the White House, New York's Capital Legacy. So the reveal already in the title is that New York City was once the capital of the United States. And just to say, this is a paper that will be expanded for a lecture I'm giving next week at Franz's Tavern in Manhattan, and then it will be published hopefully with the White House Historical Association. So please pass along feedback and questions. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America. On the streets below, crowds gathered to witness Washington, his hand placed on the Bible, be sworn in from a balcony at Federal Hall in New York City. After taking the oath of office, Washington supposedly added the words, "So help me God," and kissed the Holy Book. Following the ceremony, Washington delivered an inaugural address to the members of Congress, then attended services at St. Paul's Chapel. That evening, fireworks illuminated the sky.
the future of New York City and the nation never looked brighter. It had been a long road getting to that point. Between 1775 and 1785, first the Continental Congress and then the Confederation Congress had met temporarily in 7 different cities, namely Philadelphia, Baltimore, Lancaster, York, Princeton, Annapolis, and Trenton. Adding to its difficulties, Congress was sharply divided over the permanent home of the capital, split between those who wanted a central inland location and those who favored an established seaboard city. New York had been devastated by 7 years of British occupation, the longest such occupation of any city during the war, including 2 great fires that had burned extensive swaths of the city, first in September 1776 and then again in August 1778. But the city's fortunes had slowly improved following the British evacuation on November 25, 1783, a date celebrated for decades by the city's residents as Evacuation Day. Such that by 1790, the diverse population had grown to 40,000, of which 2,500 were enslaved people. In 1784, Chancellor Robert Livingston and the New York State Legislature beseeched the beleaguered Congress to select New York as its next meeting place. Abandoning a plan to create 2 capitals, Congress voted unanimously on December 23, 1784, to relocate from the French Arms Tower in Trenton to the city of New York. Once in New York, the Confederation Congress set about passing important legislation, including the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided for the organization of the Ohio Country and notably excluded slavery from that territory. Congress also continued debating the relative merits of various sites for the permanent capital. In Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention of 1787 failed to resolve this question and eventually voted to keep, quote, the present seat of Congress. In September 1788, the outgoing Confederation Congress similarly voted to leave the seat of government in New York for the meeting of the new Congress scheduled for March 4th, 1789. New Yorkers eagerly prepared to celebrate the changeover to the new government. At midnight on March 3rd, 13 cannons were fired from Fort George, tip of Manhattan Island, in salute of the 13 states leaving the old Confederation. Next day, flags were flown and church bells rang, but only 11 cannons fired in honor of those states that already had ratified the Constitution, not North Carolina, not Rhode Island. New York City had come to embrace its place as the nation's capital by this point. Previously, the Confederation Congress had been offered meeting space in City Hall, as well as additional rooms at the tavern kept by Samuel Black Sam Francis at Broad and Pearl Street, today's Francis Tavern. Then on September 17, 1788, the Common Council of New York City resolved to give over City Hall itself for the exclusive use of the new federal government. The council commissioned Peter Charles L'Enfant, a French emigre and continental soldier, to redesign this ancient building, constructed in 1700, into an edifice worthy of the seat of a Republican government. Work began on October 6 and continued through April 8, 1790. L'Enfant's efforts transformed the old Queen Anne facade by applying a neoclassical facelift, replete with an open balcony and topped by a bald eagle. That was this image from before. The impressive result left one congressman wondering if the building was, quote, a trap to catch the Southern men into staying permanently in New York. But many questions remained about the future of the federal government. Most critically, when would George Washington, the newly elected president and father of his country, arrive to take up his new office? And perhaps equally as important, where would he live? When Congress convened in New York City, its members were expected to lodge in private residences or boarding houses at their own expense. As a notable exception to this rule, the Confederation Congress provided furnished quarters for its president at the expense of the government. Since January 1788, the president had been Representative Cyrus Griffin of Virginia, who, following in his predecessor's footsteps, lived at a large 3-story home at number 3 Cherry Street, located about 6/10 of a mile from Federal Hall at St. George's Square, later Franklin Square. The house was situated on land formerly owned by Robert Benson, who had operated a brewery on the site. In 1770, Benson's widow, Catherine Van Borsum, and her son, Robert Benson, sold the plot to merchant Walter Franklin for £2,000. Franklin built a Georgian-style structure on the site with a front face of about 50 feet. In 1786, Franklin's widow, Maria Bound Franklin, remarried Samuel Osgood, Commissioner of the Treasury, who Washington later appointed Postmaster General. So accordingly, the home was variously known as the Walter Franklin House and the Samuel Osgood House. Nonetheless, George Washington was unclear just where he would stay in the capital as late as March 1789. Turning down an offer from New York Governor George Clinton, Washington wrote James Madison on March 30th that he would, quote, make it a point to take hired lodgings or rooms in a tavern until some house can be provided. Ultimately, he concluded, it is my wish and intention to conform to the public desire and expectation with respect to the style proper for the chief magistrate to live in. Fortunately for Washington, Congress had turned its attention to the matter. On April 15, 1789, a joint committee composed of members of the House and Senate to plan the upcoming inauguration determined to renew the lease of the house on No. 3 Cherry Street for the use by the new president. The committee resolved that Mr. Osgood, the proprietor of the house lately occupied by the President of Congress, be requested to put the same house and furniture thereof in proper condition for the residence and the use of the President of the United States. The Franklin House, described by the French minister, the Comte de Moustier, as a humble dwelling, was leased for £845 a year, with another £8,000 expended to upgrade the home. Coincidentally, Washington's next-door neighbor at No. 5 Cherry Street would be John Hancock, himself the former president of the Confederation Congress. Congressional absenteeism had been the culprit in the delay to secure a residence for the incoming president. On March 4th, 1789, the day appointed for the Confederation Congress to start the new government, only 8 senators and 13 representatives were present. A quorum finally emerged in the House on April 1, while 5 days later, the Senate achieved numbers sufficient to count the electoral votes cast for president. The next morning, Charles Thompson, Secretary of Congress, set out for Mount Vernon to inform Washington of his selection as president, which he did on the morning of April 14. Washington immediately prepared to leave for New York. Short of funds, he borrowed some £625 from neighbor Richard Conway to pay his travel expenses. All along the route, people came out to witness Washington pass by. On April 23, 1789, Washington crossed the Hudson River on a large barge and was greeted by a committee composed of Governor George Clinton, Mayor James Duane, and officers of the city's governing corporation. An elaborate parade of military officers, troops, elected officials, clergy, and citizens accompanied the president approximately 1 mile from the Battery to No. 3 Cherry Street. New York paid particular attention to the president's new house. As Sarah Osgood Robinson, the niece of Maria Osgood, relative of Samuel, wrote to her friend Kitty Wister, long quote ahead, but here we go, Uncle Walter's house in Cherry Street was taken for him, and every room furnished in the most elegant manner. Aunt Osgood and Lady Dewar had the whole management of it. I went in the morning, before the general's arrival, to look at it. The best of furniture in every room, and the greatest quantity of plate and china I ever saw. The whole of the first and second stories is papered, and the floor is covered with the richest kind of Turkey and Wilton carpets. There's scarcely anything talked about now but General Washington and his palace. Not content with the furnishings of the Franklin House, Washington expended some £400 for glass and queensware and purchased bedstands, chairs, dining, tea, breakfast, and card tables, knife boxes, washstands, and clothes presses. The efforts paid off, for upon her subsequent arrival, Martha Washington found the house, quote, handsomely furnished, all new for the general. The palace was occupied by members of the Washington family and an array of household staff. 2 Custis grandchildren, Eleanor Nellie Park and George Washington Wash Park, lived there. So did Tobias Lear, Washington's personal secretary, who supervised 4 additional secretaries. Among them, nephew Robert Lewis and Thomas Nelson, and political aide Colonel David Humphreys. Steward Samuel Francis oversaw a staff of white servants, which included a coachman, porter, cook, valet de chambre, maids, footmen, and laundresses. The Washington household also included 7 enslaved African Americans from Mount Vernon: William Billy Lee, Washington's longtime valet, and body servant Christopher Shields, Lee's nephew, and later a body servant, Austin and Giles, both footmen, Paris, a stable hand, Molly, a nursemaid to the Washington children, and Odie Judge, who later became famous for escaping from the president. Thus, a staff of 26 outnumbered the 4 family members in the residence at the Franklin House. It would be a pattern carried over to future executive residences. Even prior to settling his household, Washington participated in the first inaugural ball, called a public ball and entertainment. The event had been pushed back by a week to allow for the arrival of Martha Washington, but when it became known that she would be delayed longer than expected, the event went forward on May 7th. With nearly 300 people attending, all eyes were on the president, who danced 2 cotillions and a minuet. A week later, the French Minister de Vestiaire hosted a ball of his own. After Martha Washington arrived in the capital, she arranged a schedule of social events, most notably levees, dinners, and drawing rooms, held each Friday from 7 until 9 o'clock in the evening. George Washington attended the functions without sword or hat, as he was in his capacity as the husband of the hostess and not as President of the United States. For its part, Congress voted after a prolonged debate that the new president be simply addressed as the President of the United States without an additional title. President Washington also instituted the custom of holding state dinners each Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. The gathering included from 10 to 22 guests, in addition to the president's official family, which besides relatives included his secretarial staff. The meal tended towards roast beef, veal, lamb, turkey, duck, and varieties of games, with silver frame table ornaments adorned by chaste mythological statues. Beyond these formal social events, Washington also opened the house to the public twice per week on Tuesdays and Fridays between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, also my office hours. Congress concluded its first session on September 29, 1789, with a strong record of legislative accomplishments, among them the introduction of amendments to the Constitution and the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1789, not bad. Hoping to strengthen the bonds of union, Washington toured the New England states from October 15th to November 13th, thus establishing regular travel as another function of the presidency. Washington's first year as president at the Franklin House had proven a success. With the start of the new congressional session in January 1790, however, he determined to seize the first opportunity to upgrade the palace. Washington's chance came when French Minister de Vestiaire returned home, vacating his fine and commodious mansion at number 39 Broadway. Built in 1786 to 1787, it was owned by the merchant Alexander Macomb, who gladly offered it to Washington at an annual rent of £2,500. While more expensive than the Franklin House, it was a story higher and featured a garden extending to the banks of the Hudson River. The larger dining room could seat between 16 and 20 guests. All in all, the Macomb House, or the Mansion House, as the building later became known, was considered the finest private dwelling in the city and conveniently located 4 blocks from Federal Hall. On February 23, 1790, Washington and his family relocated to the Macomb Mansion. Upon agreeing to rent the house, Washington had surveyed the existing furniture and purchased several pieces left behind by Vestiaire, including a writing desk and chair. From there, he arranged for the construction of a 12-stall stable to accommodate his team of horses. In this way, Washington established another precedent, that of expanding the presidential residence to suit the occupants' needs. Hopeful about its possible future as the nation's capital, New York City prepared to construct a permanent presidential residence. On March 16, 1790, the state legislature established a building commission and subsequently provided the funding of £8,000 to build a grand house on the site of Fort George on Broadway. Today's the Battery, Bowling Green. Dubbed Government House, the red brick colonnaded 2-story structure designed by architect John McCone Jr. notably featured a front portico composed of ionic columns. Yet Government House was never to fulfill its original purpose as the president's home. It was eventually demolished in 1850, and that's where today's old Patton Custom House is, today's Native American. From the Macomb House, Washington settled into the duties of the presidency. He began to call upon individual officers of the cabinet for advice, including Thomas Jefferson, who had recently returned from France. He also paid special attention to the military and diplomatic duties of the position, monitoring the Army's effort in the Ohio country, and signing the nation's first treaty with representatives from the Creek Nation. Washington was thus learning the extent of his executive powers in New York. Meanwhile, Congress continued to debate the future location of the capital. The political currents were running strongly against New York, with many favoring a return to Philadelphia. Dr. Benjamin Rush echoed the sentiments of others when he declared, "I rejoice in the prospects of Congress leaving New York. It is a sink of political vice." William McClay, another Pennsylvania, similarly decried the pompous people of New York. In addition, numerous smaller cities around the nation clamored to become the capital. All the same, Congress had reached an impasse over the issue of assuming the state's Revolutionary War debts. But on or about June 20th, it's debated, Thomas Jefferson arranged for a dinner between James Madison and Alexander Hamilton at his rented house on 57 Maiden Lane. There, Madison and Hamilton ironed out what has been dubbed the dinner table bargain. In exchange for assuming federal debts, the capital would be permanently located along the Potomac River. The resulting Residence Act of 1790 was passed on July 16. A month later, on August 12th, Congress adjourned at New York City for the last time. The people of New York were disappointed and vexed at the result. A political cartoon blasting Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris's role in the legislation. Perhaps not coincidentally, Washington occupied Morris's Philadelphia mansion upon his arrival there. But the capital would not remain in Philadelphia for long, destined as it was for a new federal district created on the banks of the Potomac River near Georgetown. On Saturday, November 1st, 1800, President John Adams moved into the still unfinished White House. 2 weeks later, Congress met in Washington City for the first time on November 17. The nation had entered a new chapter. So just to conclude, what happened to the various buildings associated with the President Washington's time in the Capitol? Go back to the first one. Walter Franklin House. It went from a residence to a commercial property, remaining in family hands until 1856, when it was demolished, replaced by stores, which themselves were demolished in the 1880s to make way for the Brooklyn Bridge.
Oh.
The Macomb House also lost to time. It became a hotel called Bunker's Hotel. It was demolished in the 1850s for brownstones. That building was demolished in the 1900s for yet another building finally erected in 1926. Government House, as already mentioned, today is now the old Customs House at Bowling Green. So basically nothing's left from the original Capitol in New York City. But as I want to argue here by way of conclusion, the government itself was established there. And I think also the president's understanding of the presidency and his powers. So wrapping up, despite fits and starts, the 5.5-year period when New York City was the capital set into motion great changes. There, the old Confederation government ended and the new federal government started. There, Congress and the presidency both realized the extent of their powers. And there, before the White House, stood the first 2 presidential residences. We're calling New York's capital legacy that reminds us of where the new American nation first took shape.
Thank you to all 3 of our panelists for their papers. I'm going to begin with a point of commonality among these 3 papers and then examine them individually. And then we'll have time for questions. So the topics we've heard today: political and military decisions made by indigenous peoples in the Southeast, politics of Wigs. I am debating on whether or not that was an intentional pun. In the American Revolution, and the struggle to shape the American presidency in its early years, very widely in scope. Yet, all 3 of these papers have extended their arguments by examining the material world of their topics. Ben's research on the Choctaw and Chickasaw people commitment to navigating their way through the American Revolution is reinforced by images which demonstrate that clothing, as well as words, are part of both diplomacy and identity. Jennifer's portraits and cartoons exhibits the respective reverence and disdain offered to male and female wig wearers in the 18th century. Tom's maps, engravings, and drawings have given us a vivid picture of New York City in the 1780s, and I'll continue this discussion later in my comment. So in all 3 papers, we can see the impact of material culture studies on the history profession. It's my sincere hope that this source base remains part of scholarship on the Revolutionary era. So now we'll turn to the individual papers. Ben ably demonstrates that the Revolution was a conflict with multiple battles for political and cultural sovereignty. This was not only about the United States. British Army officers saw indigenous peoples as allies who would support the British Empire without question. But when the Revolutionary War began, the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes had lived alongside European colonists for decades. Both had lost thousands of tribal peoples to disease and to battle. they had negotiated trade and political agreements with their European neighbors. And as Ben reminds us, these histories came with them to the negotiating table. The Choctaw were divided over whether to ally with the British or with the French or even Spanish long-term trading partners. The Chickasaw, by contrast, brought older alliances with Britain to the table, but ultimately decided that making peace with the United States would better aid their own survival. And Ben has done an excellent job tracing these diverging stories. And however, since both of these papers came out of class papers written last semester, one of the challenges, and this is a conversation I had with both Ben and Jennifer in the fall, about writing a paper for a class, is that a semester holds an infinite number of days. There are limits to the research that even the most dedicated and competent of students can do. But, as I mentioned, Ben is graduating this semester, and I hope this is a topic that he returns to in the future, because I strongly suspect those archives have a lot more stories to tell you. In the meantime, I came across a review this week for a new book titled 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South During America's Revolutionary Era, and I think that's a great place to head next. Jennifer has taken us in a very different direction with her discussion of the collision of hairstyles, gender anxiety, and the American Revolution. As she notes, wigs for men and wigs for women followed different trajectories in the 18th century. Ever more extravagant styles for male wigs reached their peak in the early to mid-18th century. This collapse coincided with growing restrictions on imported luxury goods in Britain, most notably the Calico Acts of 1700 and 1721. And this, as Jennifer points out, lays the groundwork for the construction of British narratives about patriotic men in simple hairstyles and plain clothing. Female wigs, by contrast, did not reach their peak until the late 18th century. By that time, first the American Revolution and later the French Revolution were roiling the Atlantic world, vocally expressing concerns about female sartorial extravagance provided a common male language across the revolutionary divides. And as Jennifer continues to unravel the intersections of gender, fashion, and war in the 18th century Atlantic world, two books I suggest she consider are Maxine Berg's Luxury and Pleasure in 18th Century Britain and John Chauvelin's The Political Economy of Virtue, Luxury, Patriotism, and the Origins of the French Revolution. So I'm going to turn now to our third paper, which looks at New York City's role in shaping the presidency in the United States during their formative years. And Tom has done an excellent job recreating the built environment of 18th century New York for us. As a side note, there's a marker noting Postmaster General Samuel Osgood's birthplace a few thousand yards away from my house, which is on Osgood Street. And I've walked past that a million times. He argues that multiple elements of the American presidency that we now take for granted, the relative simplicity of the title, the creation of the executive household, and the availability of the president to the public were established during this period and in this place. I am, however, curious to know more about his thoughts on the creation of these components of the American presidency. Would they have come into existence regardless of where Washington served his first years as president? Or are they direct products of New York's own history as a place founded by Dutch colonists, taken over by English colonists, in time occupied by the British Army, a place which has gone through many, many political transitions and reinventions? And here, the ever-expanding scholarship on Dutch New York and the ways in which Dutch culture survived into the 18th century may prove helpful. And if you have not done so already, I also recommend talking to Benjamin Karp, whose current book project gave me much the same feeling of traversing through the streets of a long-gone New York City when I read a draft of it last summer. So we are now approaching the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. Whether here in Massachusetts or elsewhere, the coming anniversary provides a moment for us to reflect on our collective past as a nation. These papers have taken this moment even further by examining the Revolution through new lenses, whether the experiences of indigenous peoples in the revolutionary Southeast, the utilization of fashion to express gendered anxieties during wartime, or the impact that the city of New York had on the development of both the American presidency and the American nation in the 1780s. And as we move ever closer to the commemorations of the Revolution in 2025 and 2026, I hope that this panel is only the start of new research and new viewpoints on the Revolutionary era. And now I open it up to the audience for questions for our three panelists.
I've got a question for Ben. You were talking about the Native American alliances and trading. Did the British or the French arm them at all, or was it? Did you run across anything like that?
That was actually a very important part of this story. So, when I was talking about trade, how the British kind of motivated the natives by trade to fight for them, it would be arms and ammunition. That would be a large part. So that was a great question. Yeah, that was a very important detail.
Thank you.
I have a question for Jenny. In which you stitch together the historical and the literary and the visual and the textual and material, right? You bring all these different things together. I want to ask you about the 432, I think was the number that you used, portraits in the 4 museums. How did you pick those museums, and how did you decide to sort those? How did you keep track of those?
I would say that I'm very grateful for a lot of museum websites that have really functional search tools. I didn't have too strict parameters for the museums, but I decided to pick ones that were mostly in the Northeast, with the exception of the Art Institute of Chicago. So those are Art Institute of Chicago, National Gallery of Art, and MFA, and the Met. And on their websites, I was able to go into like sort of the advanced search setting, and I selected American-made portraits between the years 1700 and 1799. And from there, I was just able to pick like approximately 100 from each of them. That was how many we had. Looked through all of them, and the best part was that I was able to sort them in like by the date they were made, so I could really easily see the differences between men's hairstyles, women's hairstyles, and how sudden the drop off was in men's sort of elaborate hairstyles. Like right around 1770. All of a sudden, all their hair was gone. It was just all their natural hair. It was very short. It's totally different from what it looked like a decade earlier. So I'm grateful to the museum's websites for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for both of you. My question is to you, and did you find your activities any kind of relationship with these Native Americans to the Africans who have been influenced, were slaves?
Yes. So my research, I didn't look into African slaves as much, like their relationships with natives. I do know that was looked at as a problem, but African slaves were typically Native. The reason why African slaves first came to America was because Native Americans were being so heavily decimated by disease, so they weren't looked at as effective slaves because they constantly had to be replaced because they kept dying. African slaves had a stronger immune system, so I know that that's the reason why they were brought in. So there wasn't a ton of mixing. between the natives and the African slaves. The natives were more of a sovereign power at this time. They were more of a separate group. So they were kind of like my paper states, they were kind of like looking for their own interests as opposed to the African slaves who were more under control and weren't really making their own decisions, obviously.
None of the locals speak about it.
Not too much from what I've seen.
And I have one small question for Jenny. I'm just curious to know, I'm really enjoying your paper. What is the hair doing, or like hairstyles of other ethnicities like Africans again? When Africans actually began to use wigs, for instance, it's a complicated history of them, right? Because and Chinese too. I mean, Chinese immigrants were in America during that time. So I'm just
I would say from what I found, the access to wigs was mostly limited by money. That would be the main thing. So if you were lucky enough to have a wig, then you had it. I mean, they came in all different styles, colors, textures. So, and because a lot of them are made out of human hair, you could, with this unfortunate, histories of, you definitely were able to get hair from people of all different races, mostly women. So you could get hairstyles to match your own hair. You could get, different colors and textures. I would say that New York Baltimore paper who did research into the wig making at George Washington's residence. Her focus was on what she called black barbering, which is to say that she found a large amount of enslaved people at the Washington residence. Their main job was to make, prepare wigs for anyone who came through that area. And it was pretty extensive, and they had been doing it for a long time. So I think probably the main limiting factor was if you were able to purchase one. But I will say I did not do any research into other ethnicities of people, so I would very much like to continue that in my further work.
Also, it's a history, right? And it's not just the financial factor that matters. It's also like it's a style, something that someone would want to see themselves. It's also like the perspective of beauty itself, right? And how the history of who is beautiful and what makes you beautiful. Like if a woman without particular nature of hair, where are you getting all those ideas from, right? It's interesting. Thank you very much.
Question for you. You mentioned the New York legislature put up the money to build what was going to be the president's mansion. I don't know if you know the answer to this. Why would the New York legislature put up that money rather than the federal government? Was the federal government openly saying we're thinking about leaving at that point, and that was their Hail Mary, if you will, to say, please stay, we'll build the president a house, or is there something else at work?
I think it's a good question. It's sort of like in the transition between the one government to the next, the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, it was nebulous, ultimately, how the process of this new federal district and its creation would work. It was provided for in the Constitution, but it wasn't clear if the land would be purchased by the government or donated by the states, and that will ultimately what happens. You have Maryland and Virginia giving these 10 square miles, and as we see in the later case with Virginia, the state felt it had the right to recede that, to take it back, and that's why we have Alexandria as its own municipality and not part of the District of Columbia anymore. So, I mean, in a sense, it was unclear if the state would be giving the land to the federal government and thus the buildings upon it, or if it would be somehow compensated in turn. The government at this time was not in a position financially to construct anything. I mean, I think essentially in 1790 you have a weak, more or less ineffective sort of federal government that does not have funds to build at this point. had not yet resolved the issue of the state debt. So it was a government on paper, I would say. It was beginning to get its footing, but it could not build. There were no federal sort of building projects possible in the year 1790. So the state still picked up that slack. But I also think it's part of a strategy that had been in place since 1784 by New Yorkers to lure the government to come to the capital. So it was a partnership between state and city. That's how I kind of see it, is that this is still a time when state governments had a kind of outsized role in the nation's development.
Hi, this is for Professor Balcerski. I'm very familiar with your work on the 1850s and politics and gender. And your paper is so good, and I love the ad hoc nature of the federal government, and I think that might be able to tell us something about the legislation that's going on. What I want to ask is whether you can take your gender expertise and say anything about the very ad hoc living quarters of the Congress people, or the president, or whether there's, because we have Catherine Algore's study on the women in the social life of the early republic and the way women are able to get into political debates and discussions, and a variety of different things. And so I'm wondering whether your expertise on gender analysis can tell us anything about this very ad hoc arrangement, which I love to be reminded of. It's very nice.
I think I thankfully learned something today from my fellow panelists that would help me answer it, which is to say, I will look at those portraits differently, especially when it comes to both male and female hair. So that's one piece. I know that's a bit cheap answer, but let me just say on top of that I think you're right to push me in that direction. I don't have, at least in my, to where I'm working, knowledge, a source that allows me to unpack that as easily. You're right about Washington, D.C., starting with Jefferson's presidency. That's where the analysis begins with Al Gore's study. I don't have, as far as I know, a text that helps me get into that same way. So one could maybe work backwards and suggest that there were prototypes available. Maybe that's part of what we need to uncover some more. But I appreciate the push. I think Martha Washington is an important figure here. She establishes certain protocols. But the women of New York, that's essentially what I think you're getting to. We have them here. We have Lady Durer, we have the Robinsons. To what extent were they kind of foreshadowing, say, Margaret Bayard Smith? That's what a question that can help me think about it some more.
She should have lived in New York.
Precisely. Instead, she's stuck in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So I think it's a great question. I don't really have a great answer yet, but thanks for helping me get there.
Have any other questions?
Yes. I have another one for Jenny, because I'm fascinated by this question of wigs. And I think Dr. Chandler sort of pointed the way towards this with her suggestion about a book that you might look at. And that is this an American phenomenon? Right? That men's wigs go up and down, and then it's like the whole great scenario that you described. Or do we see parallels in England, in France, and other places?
I'd say there are definitely parallels between America and England. I didn't do as much research into France as I would have liked, because I would love to get into those like super elaborate teenage hairstyles. But I know that in England there was talk of a tax on hair powder, which was one of the major components in hair care in the 18th centuries. And it was primarily made of wheat starch. And so the thought behind it was because food prices were rising. If you tax hair powder, then grain will go towards bread instead of powder. It was not well thought out. It didn't really work. People still used hair powder. So I would say there was definitely these concerns about whether or not it was appropriate to have these sort of outlandish, luxurious hairstyles for both men and women. But I think definitely in America, it took a much more severe turn around the Revolution. Because like I mentioned, you had these like movements about self-sufficiency, virtue. We don't need the, outlandish, excesses of Europe, where patriotic, self-sufficient Americans. So I think probably this specific timeline fits best with America. Thank you.
I have one other question. It's from Ms. Quinn. Hi. I loved your paper. There's a lot of calling things by decades and 1760s, 1770s revolution. I'm wondering about military service. I don't think you can wear a wig on campaign. And I'm wondering, particularly for men, whether we can pinpoint a change that's actually before military service or whether this is something that goes on during the war itself. And it's also my idea, which I think we explored in class just like a year ago, of wars as very gendered experiences, both for men and women. It's one of the most gendered things that a society can do in this set of centuries. And so I'm wondering if the artificial reinforcement of the importance of gender in the culture has something to do with this, and that whether that's a factor that can be thrown into the mix of luxury and the femininity and the rest of it, whether there's another thing going on here. And I wonder if maybe being very precise about time and years is really going to be a next step for that great study of the 452 paintings, which is really great. Like, I happen to think women's hairstyles change in 1856 specifically. I think it's Jessie Frank. I think she becomes like the celebrity, and it's like when everybody wanted Jennifer Aniston's hairstyle after the first year of Friends. So I'm wondering about being precise.
I didn't look into things quite as precisely as that, but I think you're definitely right to notice the ways in which those hairstyles are impractical for different areas of service and different areas of labor. I will say one of the things that I found specifically was that if you were a gentleman wearing a wig, part of the performance of it was that you were wealthy enough to not perform manual labor. And because it was so difficult to keep on your head, you were showing off that not only were you able to afford this, you didn't have to do sorts of demanding labor, you didn't have to bend over, you didn't have to do things. You could keep up this sort of dignified, air about you. I will also say, though, that soldiers, like foot soldiers in the American Revolution, did carry hair powder with them as one of their, part of their kit. It was ordered by, I forgot who, it might have been General Washington. He ordered large quantities of hair powder for his soldiers, including his officers, but including the foot soldiers too, because it was not only a beauty standard, it was also a way to ensure cleanliness. So I think that, and then when you have the powder, when you have the pomade, which kind of go hand in hand, you can sort of create the style of the wig without actually having to wear one. So I think wigs versus styles reminiscent of wigs is somewhat of an artificial line. But I will also say that I think part of my generalization has to do with the fact that I looked at portraits, and they were not portraits of people who had been foot soldiers. They were portraits of officers. So I think definitely it's easier to see a chronological trend rather than a sort of the trends within like one's own relation to labor. But that is something I definitely want to look into more. And it is, this is definitely looking at the higher class people and not really people who would have actually had to worry about those kinds of things. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you to everyone for joining us.